For nearly half a century, it was an obvious, clear norm. If you wanted to be the president of the United States, you had to show the American public where your money came from. It was a norm that began, amazingly, with Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal in 1973, when Nixon released his tax returns to fight off accusations of corruption. In fact, it was Nixon's tax filings that sparked one of the most famous quotes in American politics.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Since then, every American president has released their tax returns or a summary of their taxes. Well, all but one. And you know which one, and you know why, or at least his explanation of why.
I will absolutely give my return, but I'm being audited now for 2 or 3 years, so I can't do it until the audit is finished, obviously.
It's under audit. I'll release them when the audit's completed.
My tax returns are very simple. They're under a minor audit, routine audit, as they have been for many years. Every year I get audited. At the appropriate time, I will release them. But right now I'm under routine audit. Nobody cares.
Now, when Donald Trump was a candidate, there was no way of verifying whether he was actually being audited. But as soon as he became president, he became subject to a one-line provision in the IRS handbook, also dating back to the 70s. The handbook specifies that the individual tax returns for the president and the vice president are subject to mandatory review. So during his presidency, Donald Trump was being audited, like every other American president. Right? Wrong. That's the big revelation in Tuesday's report from the House Ways and Means Committee, which found that the IRS didn't perform any mandatory audits of Trump in his first 2 years as president. In fact, the IRS only began auditing Trump's pre-election tax returns in 2019, and only on the same day that House Democrats asked the IRS for Trump's tax filings and audits. The agency still hasn't finished those audits. It's not even worth asking why Trump lied. But why didn't Trump get audited as required before Congress started asking questions? We're likely to know a lot more soon, since the Ways and Means Committee, which now has years of Trump's tax returns, they also voted this week to release those returns to the public. That move comes not long after the House January 6th committee issued to the Department of Justice a criminal referral for Trump stemming from his activities on January 6th, including fomenting an insurrection. But don't forget, Trump is still under criminal investigation for his possession of those classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. They say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. But after 7 years of Donald Trump's cover-up and concealment, could it be that some light is beginning to shine through the cracks here? Is this a real turning point in the fight against executive corruption? Or is this just another flash in the pan? Let's turn now to Julian Castro. He served as Obama's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and ran for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2020. Along with him is Susan Del Percio. She's a Republican strategist and an MSNBC political analyst. So, Susan, is this too little, too late? What's the benefit to the American people of learning at this late date about Donald Trump's taxes?
Well, I think first and foremost, Melissa, what's important is that the American public know that it always catches up to you. Donald Trump did not get away with not showing the American public his taxes. They may be a few years too late, but it happened. As far as the political fallout, probably for Trump, not much, except that it adds to a really bad 3-4 weeks for Donald Trump. And people are starting to look at other potential candidates for 2024. So I don't think this hurts him necessarily with his base, but I'm just happy to see that we get to have his taxes in full view.
So, Julian, this isn't all about Donald Trump. Someone else has failed here. According to the House Ways and Means Committee, the IRS should have audited Trump's tax returns. How did this oversight even occur in the first place?
Well, I think that's the $64,000 question, Melissa, is why did the IRS not audit Donald Trump each year that they were supposed to, and only did so after they were prompted to audit by House Democrats. And even at that, as the committee released this information, the audit that was performed was a very shoddy audit that didn't ask for backup materials, basically didn't make him prove up his tax return at all, even though we're dealing with very big numbers and a very complex tax return each of these years. And so it's going to be fascinating for the committee, might be in the House, but might end up being in the Senate, because the House, of course, is changing over in leadership, and I have a feeling that the Republicans are not going to touch this. They're going to try and make sure that it dies quietly. But the Senate may be able to take up the question of what in the world happened here with the IRS. Were they under political pressure from the White House, for instance, not to go further and audit him every year? It would also, frankly, be interesting to see, is this the only president where this has happened since this law was included in the 1970s? At least I don't know that. Maybe it wasn't as uncommon as we think for the IRS not to actually audit a president. We have to be open to that as well. All of this, though, undermines the IRS's credibility. It already is an agency that over the years has been the target, especially of a lot of Republican ire. But even with everyday Americans, they wonder why there seems to be a double standard when it comes to auditing people who might make $100,000 a year, $50,000 a year, but not folks who are worth hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars like Donald Trump. It undermines their credibility even more, just like I think it adds to the baggage that Donald Trump carries with him into 2024.
So that's exactly right. I think there's been a lot of chatter on social media about what exactly is the IRS doing. There's also been some additional fresh reporting that Donald Trump is not the only one who has some secrets in the back. There's new reporting this week that Congressman-elect George Santos likely falsified large portions of his resume, including his attendance at college. Together with the fact that Trump was able to conceal his tax records while running for president, does this suggest, Susan, that we need to rethink the way we vet political candidates during the campaign?
Yes, but a lot of the issues that came up with Santos, the congressman-elect from New York, was resume questions like where he went to school and where he worked. And those were readily available to dig into. I think, though, you raise a very good question about what, moving forward, what should we expect from our elected officials? Perhaps filling out those disclosure forms or your intent to run for office may come under a federal penalty should you be lying about any of the information in there. I'm not sure how, if that could exactly work. But I do want to follow up on just one thing that the secretary mentioned, and that is that these taxes go to the Senate. And I'm also looking for them to go to the Intel Committee, because I want to know what foreign entities, if any, were Donald Trump may have been, in bed with, frankly.
So that's a great point. Julian, in addition to learning that Trump lied about his taxes, the former president also got a criminal referral from the January 6th committee. So these are a slew of negative stories that are really adding up here. But will they actually result in any consequences for the former president? You've mentioned the fact that he may lose touch with some members of the Republican Party. But other than that, is there anything here that will actually stick with him?
Well, that remains to be seen. I do think that it sends a strong signal to the American people that nobody is above the law. Frankly, it also puts some public pressure on the Department of Justice and the special counsel to drill down and to bring a criminal prosecution against Donald Trump. We don't know if that's going to happen. My guess is as good as anybody's guess, but I do think that the House has set out a marker here, and if they choose not to bring a prosecution, the bar is going to be that much higher to explain why they're not bringing one against Donald Trump. On the political end, it's no secret that there are more and more Republicans these days who are looking around wondering, look, is there somebody else here? Because this guy has so much baggage. We're risking losing the 2024 presidential election if we go with Donald Trump. Just as this one example with the taxes, what is he going to do? Is he really going to be able to stand in front of even his base of people now? And especially people in the middle who could go either way still and say, nah, I'm not going to release my tax returns this time. I'm going to do the same thing I did last time. After 2 weeks ago in New York, the Trump Organization was convicted on 17 counts related to criminal tax fraud, and now we found all of this out about his tax returns. He can't do it. He can't replay the same thing that he did before and get away with it.
Right. Quick question, switching gears. The Biden administration has asked, Julian, the Supreme Court to end Title 42. This is the Trump-era policy that limits border crossings. What's your reaction, someone from Texas, a border state, to the end of this policy? And how should the Biden administration prepare for the potential influx of asylum seekers?
Title 42 really never should have been put in place. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration held it in place for a time. Both of them really struggled to justify why it was in place. It had ostensibly a public health rationale, but basically it's the last bastion of any restrictions that are still out there with regard to COVID. I'm glad that Court of Law found basically that it was bogusly in place. And the Biden administration says that it's been preparing to be able to handle the influx of people, by some estimates 10 to 14,000 people a day, because there's a bottleneck that was created with Title 42. People waiting and waiting, sometimes crossing and being sent back. And so this frustration growing. They're waiting in these camps on the other side of the border. And it's understandable that you're going to see this bottleneck and this influx when that thing is lifted. The important point is the administration has been asking for more resources to be able to provide for Border Patrol and the whole infrastructure of care and concern so that you can handle this in a humane way, but in an orderly way. But Republicans have not been willing to dedicate the resources necessary to that. So it's fallen on churches, it's fallen on nonprofits and humanitarians to try and fill in that gap. That system is going to be tested whenever it does get lifted.